Hey, seventh graders. Today we are going to continue reading the article, The Scramble for Africa. Yesterday we started it and I read the first portion with you via a video, and then I had you annotate this section called The End of the New Imperialism. So I'm going to go ahead and go over this section quickly. I don't want to spend as much time on it since you guys already read it, but I also didn't want to not address it with you guys. And then we will go ahead and finish up the last section. So, the end of the new imperialism. Remember, we have been reading about how King Leopold took claim over a huge area within Africa and all of the different things that he has done to colonize it, and honestly, a lot of the atrocities that he has committed based on his greed. So, the other day, we were focused all on the notice and note signposts, but as we were reading, and today I want to focus a little bit more on big idea and details. So, as I was reading in general this article, one of the big ideas that I came away with, and remember, you can have multiple big ideas or slightly different ones. I think, with every one of us in class, I think we would all come up with a slightly different big idea. So if you're like, wow, Miss Halen, that isn't what I thought, that's okay. You can go ahead and look for the details for your big idea too. It doesn't matter. So big idea I came up with was that greediness can hurt others in the process. I'm going to write it up here just so that I have a visual reminder of what it is. So, can hurt others in the process or lead to horrific outcomes. So, I'll just move that up a little bit. All right, let's start this section. The end of the new imperialism. For a time, the African colonies produced almost as much wealth as was promised by the early explorers. One of the great beneficiaries of the scramble was its founder, King Leopold, who had the great luck of acquiring the Congo just as a widespread use of bicycles and the invention of automobiles created a mushrooming demand for rubber. So again, he's profiting from all of this. Great beneficiaries means it's benefiting him. At King Leopold's initiative, a British firm built a 155-mile-long narrow-gauge railway from the coast into the continent's interior. It enabled the Free State to triple its exports of caoutchouc rubber, and the profits paid for Leopold's lavish plan to beautify Brussels with grand buildings. All right, so we have a footnote here. I'm going to scroll down because I don't know what that kind of rubber is. It says it's a brand of rubber that comes from natural sources, the rubber tree, which can be found in Central Africa. Okay, so it's just a type of rubber. And then I think it's also interesting that they use these numbers, triple and 155 mile. So that's one of our signposts. And I think they're using it to emphasize how big it is and how much King Leopold is getting from this arrangement. African diamonds, precious metals, copper, cotton, palm oil, tin, and other products were also in high demand in the increasingly prosperous turn-of-the-century Europe. Political tensions among European nations stimulated competition for African ports and naval bases, and the opening of African markets on Europe's manufactured goods added still more incentives for colonizing the continent. But as the Europeans discovered, their new possessions were not necessarily cheap. During its first decade before the rubber boom, the Free State of Congo produced just enough revenue to cover 1/10 of Leopold's expenditures in 1887 to 1888. We have another number here. On top of the dicey economics, African chiefs in time took off their squabbles and inertia and singly or jointly began to fight back. So we're starting to see some resistance here. Their bows and arrows armed guerrillas, which it says in our footnote, a member of a usually small group of soldiers who do not belong to a regular army and who fight in a war as an independent unit. So they're kind of a rogue army. Almost invariably lost to the modern armies of the colonizers. But keeping these troops in Africa was expensive and not always worth the cost. For example, in the famous Battle of Adwa in 1896, 100,000 Ethiopian troops decisively defeated an Italian army and preserved their country's independence for 40 years. The German punitive eviction of Horoa and Nama people from their lands required 15,000 soldiers, cost almost $2.6 billion in 2016 dollars. This is when the article was written, and took a year to execute. So this might be a word gap here. I've heard the word, but, may not know exactly what it is. And then we get some background information here, and we get some more numbers and statistics here, just to emphasize how drastic this entire situation is. But biggest by far was the price the colonists eventually paid for the unspeakable savagery of their rule. Leopold's Belgian and native enforcers, for example, flogged, imprisoned, starved, or massacred entire villages that failed to meet the production quotas. The abuse, mutilations, and other atrocities reduced the number of the Congolese from an estimated 20 million in 1876 to 8.5 million in 1911. So just because the African people were not, specifically the Congolese here, were not meeting Leopold's demands, he started abusing them and imprisoning them and killing them. And within those 35, 36 years, their population was reduced from 20 million to 8.5. So over half of them died, which is, I think, a good detail, which I'll draw my little leaf again, for my big idea that we wrote up here: greediness can hurt others in the process or lead to horrific outcomes. Because I feel like the emphasis of this entire article is just how much Africa suffered from people trying to colonize it and other countries coming in and invading. Let's continue. The cruelty of the German rule was reflected in a proclamation of the colony's commander. He signed his name as the Great General of Mighty Kaiser von Trotha, that the 24,000 native Horoa, quote, will have to leave the country, otherwise I shall force them to do so by means of guns. Within the German colony or boundaries, every Horoa, whether armed or unarmed, with or without cattle, will be shot. I shall not accept any more women and children. So here we have a quoted word or quoted passage from this ruler, the great general of the mighty Kaiser von Trotha, quite the name he gave himself. And again, it's reaffirming this big idea that someone's greediness hurt others. He was going to exterminate them with guns. The order was later withdrawn on orders from Berlin, but 8 out of 10 Horoa were killed before they reached their new destination, and von Trotha was awarded the Order of Merit for his devotion to the fatherland. Stories of these and other abominations. So again, abominations, this may not be a word that we know, but we can kind of figure out from the context of how horrible these stories are, that it's just another noun for atrocities or horrific actions. Stories of these and other abominations were gradually appearing in European newspapers and providing ammunition for human rights and religious groups that were agitating against the African colonization. Leopold and his peers kept denying the atrocities, but what punctured their lies, according to Reader's book, was George Eastman's invention of the Kodak roll film camera. According to the Reader, another quoted passage here, determined reformers took their cameras to the Congo and returned with photographs that were truly worth more than 1,000 words. One horrifying picture shows an African man looking sorrowfully at the small hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter who had been killed, dismembered, cooked, eaten by an army of sentries. So, another detail for our big idea. In November of 1908, Leopold yielded to the widespread public condemnation of his reign in Africa and turned over his territory to the Belgian government, which annexed it and stopped its horrors. So, condemnation, this might be a word gap, but if we read the whole sentence, we can figure out its meaning when it talks about that he turned over his territory and that he yielded, which means that a lot of people were ridiculing him for owning and doing all of these things. So he turned over his territory to the Belgian government, and it withdrew and it stopped its horrors. It was the start of the crumbling of the new imperialism, a process that was greatly accelerated by U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His insistence on including the freedom for colonies in the 1941 Atlantic Charter, a document describing the Allied claims in World War II, helped persuade Britain, France, and other countries to give up their holdings in Africa. By 1961, almost all of the major European colonies in Africa achieved their independence, and since the 1970s, the continent has been self-ruled. So I think this is also telling that while this is showing their independence, it comes back to the fact that when they're self-ruled, when other people's greediness, foreigners' greediness is not getting in the way, they're independent and they've stopped the horrors, it said right here. So good things to keep in mind. All right, I'm going to stop the video here. You are going to annotate the rest of it. It's a pretty short section. You have like a couple lines there, and then just this little section here. The paragraphs are not very long, and I want you to be paying attention for our notice and note signposts. So those were the contrast and contradictions, extreme language, word gaps, numbers, quotes, things that I was just pointing out. And then I also want you to pay attention to the details to support our big idea. So again, just like we looked at this detail, this was not a detail of horrific, atrocities. This was a detail showing the opposite, that when these colonizers withdrew, that Africa became a much healthier environment in general. So you can look for positive things too for that post colonization and colonizer rule. All right, I'm going to put these slides in the next slides on this Nearpod, and you can draw on it and annotate it from there. Have a great day.